This is a talk that is a subject dear to my heart about constraints, how to define, measure, and discuss constraints. And this is the first time I've used this clicker, so let's see if I can. Yes, this is a quote that just came a couple weeks ago. This was in New York Magazine. Once you spend more than $100 million on a movie, you have to save the world. That's David Lindelof. He used to write Lost. He wrote Prometheus. And Star Trek Into Darkness. So he writes movies that they spend $100 million on, and that's the stakes that he typically works with. And so when I titled this talk, it's defining, measuring, and discussing constraints. And as I was writing it, I realized I actually had to get behind that. So let's start with defining. What am I talking about? The Oxford English Dictionary, the exercise of force to determine or confine action, coercion, compulsion, fine, you can read that too. But a constraint is a force upon something. It confines, okay. This is something I think we hear a ton in our industry. We hear the words, you can't have creativity without constraints. And maybe that's new to some of you, but I feel I've been hearing that for my entire career, that there's a sense of boundaries. And so I've been thinking about that, and you can find, like, here's Marissa Meyer in 2006, constraints shape and focus problems and provide clear challenges to overcome as well as inspiration. Creativity loves constraints. That's interesting. Creativity is kind of a motive force. It's a thing that can love. But they, meaning the constraints, must be balanced with a healthy disregard for the impossible. Here's someone a little older. It's Aristotle. I think this is about 300 BC. Would that be right? 335 BC. So in the plot, a certain length is necessary and a length which can be easily embraced by the memory. So Marissa's a little abstract, but she's feeling you need some rigid, structured systems in order to let your inner creative self shine. Aristotle, he's saying it's got to live up here in the poetics. So another great example of the kind of constraint systems that people work with, magazine covers. If you've ever worked in a magazine or dealt with them, there's a tremendous amount of drama about what goes on the cover. It's a big discussion every week or month or day. And it's a really important place in the magazine. Not anyone gets to say what goes here. And these it's obviously just a physical constraint as to what can fit. You're going to publish one every day or every week. It's going to be of a certain size. It could be one picture, as it always is with the New Yorker. It could be Beyonce. It could be an illustration in Business Week. Collectively, you're looking at, what we would think of as, 20, 30 million impressions. These images get seen a lot, and so that structure and that order and working backwards from those boundaries, it's very, very important. And it's a way that people can manage their time in their life working at magazines. It's another kind of constraint. This is an artist, classical pianist named Margaret Langton. She's very, very brilliant. She's known for a lot of her interpretive work with John Cage's pieces. But for a while, she did a lot of work with toy pianos and had to transcribe. And it's really neat. Go find it. It's on Spotify. And she had to transcribe classical works into toy piano works, and she performed them. And she's brilliant. She knew what she was doing, and she started to work within the limits of the toy piano. And there's some real pleasure there. So that's another kind of constraint that was self-enforced. Here's the classic constraint of how a screenplay should look. And this is always tricky. I remember when I was learning to write, you spend so much time trying to format your manuscripts. And then later, as time goes on, you realize nobody really cares. Like, just send it over in Word, double-spaced, page numbers, whatever. They'll figure it out later. But there really is a structure for screenplays, and there's software, there's Final Draft, and so on. Not that Casablanca was written in Final Draft, but there's a real sense of what is an official screenplay and how it should look and be structured. And when you think a little bit back to that quote, that's, this is the core document for an $100 million project, which is as big as any software project or anything else. Like, this is the spec, not the spec script, but like the actual specification for how a thing is going to get created, like a movie like Prometheus. It starts on a piece of paper like this, with very specific margins, names of characters in caps, etc. Another example of constraints, which I really love, is that this, and there's one here, I think I have a laser pointer. This guy right here, the cat is jumping to get the fish in the other bowl, in the other cup. So you can see, but there's something really fascinating about that, right? Because these people are like, oh, hey, I'm going to work within this these boundaries, and like maybe the skeleton head will come out, maybe Dolly's clock will be dripping over. This one just goes like, no, we're going to need to go to 2 cups. And this one is just straight up like, nah, printing. But also it's just kind of, whatever. It's can your Lotto do this? And it's like, it's nice, it's cool that they can print it, but it feels so anticlimactic compared to the foam cat. So I'm going to talk for a second. We're going to go from coffee to pie. I really like when I'm thinking about systems and structures, this is sort of something that's way outside of my domain. I don't bake. Apple pie contests are an incredible way to examine. If you look at how they're structured, they're a wonderful way to examine constraint systems. This is one in Bucktown outside of Chicago. Or Holstein Park. I don't know the geography well enough. This is from a couple years ago, and it's just a good, it's the reason I'm not picking on it, it's a good apple pie contest website. You can see there's some interesting semiotic signifying going on with sort of her overall look and the sleeve tattoo. But it's got a good site. It's got a lot of rules. So how to enter, the contest is open for anyone. So we're defining the society, the human beings who can be part of this apple pie culture. Pie must be checked in by 11 a.m. No other fruits may be added, et cetera. But pretty straightforward. We all know lists of rules. We've been dealing with them since we were kids. And then there's like kind of an FAQ, and it's a little more casual, but it's also like, are nuts allowed? But you can just see them just like, yeah, okay, how about bacon? Like they probably had to have a meeting, right? As long as the apple's the main player, no meat pies here, folks. And lot of information on the judging. Okay, so we're starting, you actually have to read a little bit. It breaks down to 10% appearance, 40% crust and filling, 50% on overall flavor and taste. Now, where does this come from? We go back to 1382. This was a recipe from an old recipe book, but you can see the structure, the constraints, the rules that make a good apple pie. And I was thinking about this apple pie contest. I didn't go to it. This is speculative, but at the top level, you have this kind of like this set of judges who are going to judge the quality of the apple pie, and then you're going to eventually emerge with winners. That's great. The judges are going to name winners. You're going to have entrants who wish to become winners, and then you're going to have people in the audience who are friends of entrants or fans of apple pie. And then actually kind of over to the right, whenever you have a thing like this, and this is where we get involved, there's someone who's going to take pictures. There's reporters from the paper, a kid dressed as an apple. These are the things that always happen, like the brochure woman. There's always somebody named Mike. There's the guy with the truck. There's the lady who writes the emails, and the park person, and the web person, and so on and so forth, right? So, and we all know we've all been involved with ridiculous stuff like apple pie contests. It kind of comes together this way. And I call it, because we're friends, right? And at some level in this room, this is us, and that's them. And just sort of, we often spend our time over here, and we often are kind of negotiating with people in the rest of the hierarchy. And it's just something I think about a lot, and it does tie into constraints. We'll get there in a sec. But there's a real sense of like, we kind of serve these other organizations. We're the people who help them. We don't make the apple pies. We help other people have the contest that lets them make the apple pie. So this set of rules about how to make an apple pie creates a social structure with risks, rewards, and multiple interlocking hierarchies. That's what I'm trying to say. And this is actually next year's, and I just thought it was so good. Clash of the Pie Tins. So I almost want to go and enter. So what are the constraints we just talked about? Well, we talked about material constraints, the shape of the pie, the apple requirement, the fact that it must be cooked. Cultural constraints, the rule of the contest, the shared definition of what a pie is, and external constraints, meaning the judgment of the judges. So 3 things. I'm not sure if these are the final buckets to define all constraints, but this is how I'm thinking about it right now. How are we going to then measure these? We can kind of talk about them now. We're talking about the apple pie contest. We're talking about constraints and rules and so on. But how do we actually get to the point where we can discuss them? How can we put numbers with them? How can we, what can we do to bring them into our day-to-day lives in the things we do, which usually include forms and people touching screens? This is a good example of measured constraints, different sizes of paper. Awesome, we all know it. It's kind of cool. It's a Wikipedia chart. It's a good chart. You see the letter and the legal in there. It's good stuff. I don't know about you, I like this sort of stuff. I think about it a lot. Like, what's the difference if I sit down to write a story on an A3 piece of paper versus an A2 piece of paper? Is the A2 piece of paper bigger? Or is the A2 piece, is the story bigger? Or does it have some different kind of vibe? Or is it exactly the same because I'm just dealing with words? I don't think there's any solid answer as to exactly what gets you what kind of output, but there's definitely some influence. If I sit down with a piece of A1 or, God forbid, a piece of A0, I'm going to be having a very different experience in my life than if I'm working with A6. And there's a great quote. This is a guy named William Morris. He was just a sort of brilliant artist in the late 1800s in London, political activist, architecture, textile design. He started his own publishing house. Just an incredibly influential human being. He has a great quote, which is, "You can't have art without resistance in the materials." And I think that that's a wonderful way to think about constraints. It's that the boundary offers up a form of resistance. It actually means that you're trying to get to something, and you can't quite get to it without pushing through. He was actually here, he's talking about how he doesn't buy into all these typewriters. He's like, I can only really write with a fountain pen. And, and so he is, which obviously isn't necessarily the state that we're in now, but he sees this sort of new thing, this new technology and this progress, and he rejects it a little bit. He wants the resistance. He wants the fountain pen. So I just sort of translating over to our list of constraint types, well, let's just translate it into resistance. So what would, instead of material constraints, we have material resistance. So that's things like the shape of the page, the speed of the pen, the sense of connection to the shapes of the letters. So these are the things that when we are trying to measure constraints, we're trying to understand them in some kind of analytical way. What could we even do to approach that question? It's a weird question. Cultural resistance. What can be said? That's actually a really tricky one. It's something we deal with all the time. Can I post anything I want into this form? Can I stand up in front of you guys and just spout profanity? I would love to do that. I would never do that. No, really, I mean, there's a part, obviously I could make this into like a weird art moment, and it would be but it would be really bad, and it would be contrary to the larger goal of this event, which is not to do that. And so... But what can be said? The language used is key, right? Language, depending on your take on various linguistic hypotheses, but ultimately the kind of language you use, the jargon that people understand and so on, it does have an influence on sort of what people say, the domain knowledge people need. And then there's external constraints, like is the publisher going to publish this? Will they allow you to? If they are able to, it's not always the case on the web, but very often and on the web, there are boundaries as to who can sort of flip the is published bit. And in our world, I'm thinking about it, and what are some of the material resistance, moving away from paper? Number of pixels available, memory, CPU speed, all this stuff. Best cultural resistance, actually, sometimes it feels really positive. Its best practices are actually a set of rules, and they can be very resistant as to doing things in new ways, because it's not best practices. And I mean, the last speaker had a lot to say about that. That's actually, like moving around. It just, Agile's really funny because I talk to a lot of companies, and everyone who has a successful process tends to say something like, well, we're not quite Agile. Like there's this very rigid set of pure principles that they know they're not hewing to because they want to achieve things. They can't be pure Agile and survive, they feel. And then they're very apologetic about it. They feel bad about it. External resistance in our world comes from the client, the boss. They actually are able to say yes or no. They're able to say you cannot change the color to blue. You cannot use rounded corners. You cannot use this practice because we're using this framework. Speaking of frameworks, these are amazing, powerful tools. WordPress, Ruby on Rails, Drupal, Django. They're amazing and wonderful and great, but they encode a tremendous set of constraints and resistances as to what you can do, and that struggle never ends. As people build systems online, they're constantly negotiating, having this conversation as to which framework is best. And I feel that a lot of these battles are actually over this subject. Like, where are the constraints? Where are the limits? Do I Am I willing to compromise and go this way? And I think it happens with programming language, and I think it's really actually we have this overlapping set of constraint systems that we're working with. And they're all there. It's CSS, it's JavaScript, it's HTML. And then when you build things, my God, you just run into it constantly. The things that CSS can do, things that JavaScript can do, and so on. Why are there so many languages? It's sort of historical. It's because it started with HTML and then kind of grew from there. Side note, some of the biggest sites on the web are constraint-driven platforms. What do I mean? I mean, YouTube is about the constraints and boundaries inherent in video. Why does YouTube have only really video? They don't do, be easy enough for them to do an audio player, be easy enough for them to embed text, but they're focused around this one set of constraints. Same with SoundCloud. Enormous platforms are being built around the idea that you focus on one kind of media and you get it right. Same with Pinterest. So, that's interesting. I don't have a direct answer to that. All I know is that occasionally someone comes along, picks a medium, looks at the constraints, locks them down, sets a lot of rules as to what users can do, and then they generate tens of billions of dollars of value or perceived value or imaginary internet value. It doesn't matter. But they get really, really big. There's something that will make millions of people do things if you get the boundaries right, like Pinterest, right? It's just a bunch of pictures. I mean, it's so much more. But it's like, but at some level, it's about pictures. And people weren't taking pictures that seriously before Pinterest. So you can measure constraints. How much space do I have? How much time does it take? How much does it cost? Who gets the power and authority when I do it? I think that's an important one that we often kind of touch and don't touch. And it's just like, a lot of the things we're building are to give ourselves or other people power, and that comes into the rules and the systems that we build. We think about that, and it's a lot of times that's sort of back channel. It's we can't allow anyone to post to that area of the site, or we can't allow or the boss doesn't like yellow. It can be really weird stuff like that. I've been in situations where the boss doesn't like yellow, but these are really abstract. Okay? The specific thing, when you're working professionally, and I find this as a writer, I'm constantly thinking in word counts. And I was trying to talk about this with somebody the other day. 2,000 words means a very specific thing to me. It means a couple sections. It is, like, there's an actual set of rules. If you say I need a 2,000-word piece, there's about 20 or 30 things that I know from that. And that's after 20 years in the business. And there's 140 characters in 2,000 words, and I don't have to read them all to you. It's just sort of like, we are surrounded by, we discuss, we engage with these boundaries constantly. When we watch television, when we watch movies, when we take pictures with cameras, when we use our laptops, et cetera, et cetera. There's also weird stuff like the JavaScript demo, where people try to do as much as they can with JavaScript. And so, professionally, we all do negotiate and deal with very specific metrics, almost always associated with numbers, but there's also some good abstract ways to talk about this stuff too. I'm honestly just coming to you guys with this. I don't have a solid answer as to how to say, like, well, that constraint will deliver this much resistance. It's not electrical engineering. It's a really, this is a soft art, but just identifying them and just looking for them and going like, you know what? We see them everywhere. We talk about them. They define media. And just talking about that a little more might be helpful. Discussing them. Well, my God, there's a whole industry of discussing them. There's the Weblog Handbook, screenplay. That's a classic in screenplay writing. That one's less classic. How to write a book this weekend. Time, time plus the idea of a book, which is a certain length, 50,000 plus words usually. How to read a book, which is actually a classic bit of criticism. How to paint like the old masters. How to design programs. This one I love, Just Not Your Enemy. It's about white space. Here's another set, journalistic writing, Chicago manual style, elements of typographic style, elements of journalism. All of these define constraints. So elements, pieces, rules, content strategy for mobile. And here's a lot of great art. All at once that I put on a slide. But what I'm really trying to get to is like, what am I going to do with the can? It's not going to fit. I'll just repeat it. Each of these guys worked in their own thing. They're really, this is Pollock, Magnan, Lichtenstein and Warhol, right? Like, they're very, very emblematic. You know the boundaries that they worked within, and so does every artist. And this is another piece of art. I found this not too long ago, and what's the guy's name? Vuk Vidor, an artist from Belgrade working in Paris. This is called Art History, and it's a list. And it's just who owns what, right? So like Christo owns wrappings, and you know, and it just like, it holds their own slogans. It's this sense of various artists possessing these things. They create a system of constraints. They create boundaries that let them work and define themselves, but then at the same time, they kind of create a territory. And this is, you know, how to make a Tumblr blog. This kind of concept of like, what are the rules? People pick this up. They soak it out of the world, and you know, we're always actually looking at, like, you see this and you recognize it. This is a big part of the internet, is talking about these systems and making fun of them and the rules of them. And so what I think is you kind of can't have constraints without these territories emerging. Like, you create a constraint, even a good one, even an 140-character block that keeps everybody talking, or even something really holistic and nice in your user experience, you're going to unintentionally or intentionally create a territory. You're going to create a space. Someone is going to say, this is the right way to do it, and someone is supposed to follow along. And in some ways, that's our job. Our job is to say, fill this out this way. Our job is to say, do this, upload this picture this way, use the app this way, and to follow along with how other people are doing it. Just some classics, right? Like here, these are some real territory creators that I just showed you, the Twitter box, the Facebook upload box. And here is a classic. It's my hometown paper. It's the New York Times. And I made it just as an exercise one day. I tried to figure out who owned all of these spaces. And I started to realize this, you know, if you editor, opinion editor, section editor, so on and so forth, there's a little space for me up there where you log in. But just to think about it, there are hundreds and hundreds of people, especially when you consider the ad networks, who are involved with just this specific page, right? And so making these maps is interesting. It's a fun exercise. I actually suggest that when you're working on a client project and trying to get started, making a map of the culture, starting with their homepage and figuring out who owns what, can create an enormous, it can be really helpful when you're later dealing with terrible cultural sensitivities and they're angry with you for changing things. So lots and lots of people involved on that big site. And I guess the way I would make that as a motto is that every pixel has an owner. And if you just think that way, you can save yourself a lot of stress. And the way that the internet dramatizes this very much, there's a whole meme that you are not a photographer. You are not, just because you have an expensive camera. There's this real boundary as to who gets to say if they're a photographer or not. This is an angry thing about Marissa Mayer, where people are, she said there's no such thing as professional photographers, so professional photographers took a mean photo of her and put it with that quote. I got to keep moving, but just because you think you can use Photoshop does not mean that you should. I don't think this person is good. I don't think this person is that great at Photoshop, but whatever. But these, again, territories, this is very tribal identity to the point that that person did that, right? That's a strong cup of coffee. That is actual tribal, like this is intense. That I don't even, where the hell, like that's just so bad. That's going to be really, like 50 years from now, can you imagine? Although probably we'll all be supporting it. So my larger point, I'm at 0 seconds. A good user experience is one that educates its users as to the constraints in the system, right? It tells them what to do, how to fill it out, what the credit card number needs to do, the phone number, and so on. We talk about this stuff all the time. A good UX designer is good at communicating constraints and both creating a relaxing resistance in the material. So you're building things that are both resistant and have constraints, but also kind of can free people from certain constraints. Big subject, but just sort of let it float around in your brain. UX work is about communicating systems of constraints to users. I think that if that's a thing that I've been thinking a lot about quite a bit. Like, what are we actually trying to do when we create these interfaces? We're trying to tell people how to work within the boundaries that we have created. So hopefully this quote makes a little more sense in an abstract way. He's working backwards for money and time. You got to have $100 million to make this movie. What do you need to do to demonstrate that value? You actually have to save the world. And that is my talk about constraints. Thank you very much.